Have you ever wondered how a utopian dream, one of freedom and universal brotherhood, somehow ended up sparking the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack one of the most powerful, transformative, and honestly destructive forces in modern history. We are talking about European nationalism. So let's just dive right into this and see exactly how an idea that started with this incredible promise of liberation eventually set the entire globe on fire.
To really wrap our heads around this monumental shift, here is our roadmap for today. First up, the invention of the nation. Then, we'll look at culture, resistance, and revolt. Third, forging nations by force. Fourth, how people actually visualize these new nations. And finally, number 5, the descent into disaster.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the invention of the nation, from utopian dreams to reality.
So, what actually makes a nation? Back in 1848, a French artist named Frédéric Soryu created this incredibly famous utopian print. It showed the peoples of Europe and America just marching peacefully together, organized as distinct nations, all identified by their specific flags. But here's the catch. At that time, many of those nations, like Germany and Italy, didn't even exist yet. They were just these fragmented little kingdoms and sprawling empires. So if a nation isn't just a set of borders drawn on a map, what is it? What truly binds a group of people together into a unified nation-state?
Well, the French philosopher Ernst Renan actually tackled that exact question in 1882. He pushed back against the whole idea that a nation is just about having a common language, or race, or religion. Instead, he argued that it's really about having a shared heroic past and a common will in the present. He famously called the existence of a nation a daily plebiscite, which basically means a daily vote. Think about that. A nation exists because its people actively choose to be part of it together, every single day, bound by their shared sacrifices.
The crucial thing here is understanding how we actually got to that idea. The whole concept basically exploded in 1789 with the French Revolution. That was a huge game changer because it radically transferred power away from an absolute monarch directly to the citizens. Then, in 1804, Napoleon takes over. Now, he exported a lot of these rational, revolutionary systems across Europe through his civil code, abolishing feudalism, standardizing laws, that sort of thing. But he also brought strict censorship and forced conscription, not exactly a purely liberating force. Finally, in 1815, after Napoleon is defeated, the conservative powers of Europe get together at the Congress of Vienna, and they essentially tried to hit the rewind button, restoring all the old monarchs and squashing these new, pesky liberal ideas.
But, as we know, you really can't put the genie back in the bottle once it's out, which brings us to Section 2, culture, resistance, and revolt.
So after 1815, these massive ideological battle lines were drawn across the continent. On one side, you had the liberal nationalists. These were mostly your educated middle-class professionals and businessmen, and they were demanding things like representative government, freedom of the press, and unified economic markets, so they didn't have to deal with annoying regional customs barriers every few miles. Pushing back against them was the new conservatism. These were the restored monarchies and aristocrats, and they were absolutely desperate to preserve traditional institutions, state churches, and strict censorship just to keep the masses in line. And because these conservatives drove the political liberals underground, the resistance, well, they had to get pretty creative.
Enter the fascinating cultural movement of Romanticism. Romantic artists and thinkers completely rejected cold, hard science. Instead, they focused heavily on emotions, intuition, and mystical feelings to forge a shared collective heritage. Take the Grimm brothers, for example. They didn't just collect fairy tales for fun. They actually did it to uncover the quote-unquote true German spirit and build up a national identity to push back against French influence. In places like Poland, which, by the way, had been literally wiped off the map by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, culture became a legitimate weapon. Polish operas and folk dances were used to keep the national dream alive. And when Russia outright banned the Polish language in schools, priests started using it in churches as a direct act of defiance. Culture, stories, and language basically became the invisible borders of nations that hadn't even been born yet.
But we have to remember, it wasn't just about poetry and fairy tales. A lot of this was about sheer, grinding human desperation. The 1830s and 40s were times of immense economic hardship in Europe. Take a look at Silesia in 1845. You had 18,000 cotton weavers living in absolute misery. They were being horribly exploited by contractors who drastically cut their pay. So what happened? The starving weavers finally snapped.
They marched right on their employers' mansions, smashing windows and plundering supplies. The contractors fled, called in the military, and 11 weavers were shot dead. It is absolutely vital to remember that these grand, sweeping political shifts were deeply, deeply fueled by the literal hunger and hardship of ordinary people who were just demanding a better life.
By 1848, massive popular revolts had swept across Europe, but they were largely crushed by the conservative powers. And that leads us to Section 3, Forging Nations by Force, or when the army becomes the architect.
The democratic dreams of 1848, they failed. So nationalism mutated. It ended up being co-opted by the exact same conservatives who used to be terrified of it. Just look at how Germany and Italy were finally unified. In Germany, the main architect was Otto von Bismarck, the chief minister of Prussia. And he didn't rely on democratic votes. No, he relied on the ruthless efficiency of the Prussian army and its bureaucracy. Over in Italy, it was a bit different. You had this clever diplomacy by Chief Minister Cavour, paired up with Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was leading a grassroots army of volunteers known as the Red Shirts. Yet, despite the different methods, the end result in both cases was exactly the same. Traditional kings, the Prussian king and King Victor Emmanuel II, were crowned as the absolute rulers of these newly forged, powerful nation-states.
Bismarck's playbook for Germany is really the perfect illustration of this new, incredibly aggressive brand of nationalism. Like I said, he wasn't using romantic poetry, he used iron and blood. His strategy was brutal, but highly methodical. Step 1, provoke a war with Denmark, just to grab some territory. Step 2, completely turn on his former ally Austria and defeat them to assert Prussian dominance. Step 3, provoke and ultimately crush France in 1871. That is 3 calculated major wars in just 7 years. Through sheer military might, he stitched the German states together and officially proclaimed the new German Empire right in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The army had quite literally become the architect of the nation.
But get this, here is a truly incredible detail that really highlights the massive disconnect between the elite architects of these nations and the everyday common people. During the whole process of Italian unification, Garibaldi's armed volunteers were marching through southern Italy, rallying all the local peasants to help drive out their Spanish rulers. But illiteracy rates down there were incredibly high. The peasant masses who were cheering for Garibaldi and a united Italy had never actually heard the word Italia before. In fact, they genuinely believed that L'Italia was King Victor Emmanuel's wife. I mean, think about that. They were literally fighting and dying for a political concept they couldn't even define.
So that begs the question, if the common people didn't really grasp the abstract political theory of nationalism, how do you actually make them feel a sense of loyalty to a brand new nation? That brings us to Section 4, Visualizing the New Nations. Well, artists found a pretty brilliant solution. They gave a literal face to the nation, using allegory. An allegory is just when an abstract idea, like freedom or justice, or in this case, a nation, is expressed through a person or a physical thing. You know how justice is often portrayed as a blindfolded woman holding scales? Same concept. 19th century artists started personifying these newly forged countries as female figures. Over in France, they used Marianne, which was a very popular Christian name, to symbolize the people's nation. They stamped her face on coins, put her on postage stamps, and erected public statues so everyday citizens had a concrete, recognizable symbol of unity to actually identify with.
In Germany, their allegory was named Germania. And if you decode her image, it tells you exactly what the new German nation valued at the time. She wears this heavy breastplate emblazoned with an eagle, which projects the immense strength of the German Empire. On her head is a crown of oak leaves, because the German oak stood for heroism. She's holding a sword, signaling a clear readiness to fight, while broken chains lie right at her feet, symbolizing freedom. So you can see, this wasn't some peaceful utopian figure like the one we saw at the very beginning of our explainer. This was a highly militant, powerful guardian of the state.
But we really can't ignore the strange case of Britain here because it's so different. Unlike the rest of Europe, Britain wasn't forged through a sudden revolution or by organic cultural allegories. It was the result of a very long, very calculated process of dominance. The English Parliament essentially forged a nation-state by systematically suppressing the cultures of the Scottish Highlanders and Irish Catholics. Scottish Highlanders were actually forbidden to speak their native Gaelic language or even wear their national dress. Ireland was forcibly incorporated into the United Kingdom after their revolts were brutally suppressed. So a new British nation was built, but certainly not by celebrating diversity. It was built by forcefully propagating a dominant English culture over its subordinate partners.
And sadly, all of this brings us to our final and definitely most tragic chapter, Section 5, the descent into disaster, the nightmare of 1914. By the late 19th century, that idealistic democratic nationalism of the early days, that was completely gone. It had twisted into a narrow, highly intolerant creed. And the absolute most dangerous place on earth at that time was the Balkans. The Balkans were a region of extreme ethnic variation. We're talking about modern-day Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and several others. For centuries, they'd been ruled by the Ottoman Empire. But as the Ottomans started to slowly collapse, these diverse Islamic nationalities violently scrambled for their independence and for territory. And to make matters infinitely worse, the big powers of Europe, Russia, Germany, England, and Austria-Hungary, were fiercely competing to expand their own imperial control over this chaotic region. It was, quite literally, a powder keg waiting to blow.
And that leads us to the ultimate tragic equation. When you combine this new, incredibly aggressive form of nationalism with the raw greed of imperialism, the result was a global disaster. The major European powers actively manipulated the nationalist dreams of smaller groups in the Balkans, simply to further their own massive imperial empires. The cascading series of rivalries, shifting alliances, and fierce nationalist clashes in the specific region acted as the final spark. In 1914, the powder keg finally exploded, dragging the entire continent into the absolute, unprecedented horrors of the First World War. Which leaves us with this final, really profound question to consider today. Is national identity a necessary tool for liberation, or is it a dangerous weapon of domination? We've seen how the idea of the nation genuinely inspired people to overthrow despots, to cherish their folklore, and to demand equality. But we've also seen how it was completely weaponized by powerful states to suppress minorities, build massive armies, and march the entire world into disaster. The legacy of 19th century European nationalism is definitely one we are still grappling with today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep asking the big questions.